recordings are these recordings are saved and posted on the Santa Cruz County Library YouTube channel so that you can access them. And I believe there's a link. Um, well, maybe there'll be a link to the let's see, the YouTube channel. So it's youtube.com at Santa Cruz PL1/videos. Sorry, I couldn't post that. I'll
Yeah,
try posting it here, but uh, that's a link where you
you could just go to YouTube and look for Santa Cruz Public Library, and then within Santa Cruz Public Library in the search bar, you just look for Genealogical Society or GSSCC, and you'll get all of them. Also, our speaker today said that she's only allowing us to use it for 1 month, but
okay.
I'll share the audio file with you guys in case you ever get the ability to post video on your website.
Great. Thanks, Victor. Um, so I'll go ahead and make the introduction for our today's speaker. So today we're privileged to welcome Martha Wallace. Martha volunteers at the Rengstorff House in Mountain View, and she's also a volunteers at the National Archives in San Bruno. Ms. Wallace will show us how to look beyond the bounds of the family group sheets and vital statistics to learn about other facets of our ancestors' lives. There is much more we can discover besides the bare facts of family births, marriages, and deaths. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. So note in the interface with Zoom, there's a Q&A button there that you can click on and you can post questions. At the end of Martha's presentation, we'll go through the questions. We'll have time to answer the questions. Thank you. And with that, go ahead, Martha. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'm glad to be here today to share this plan with you. I'm also hoping that there are some people from Wise County, Texas attending today because they can hear a story that I've built around that location. So, do you ever wonder what the everyday life of an ancestor was like? Do you wonder why certain things happened? Why did they move? Why did they die at an early age? Why did they get married? You can build a well-rounded picture of your ancestors' lives and add depth to their family story by using the world cultures model. Years ago, I made a book about my great-grandmother, Minnie. She was born in 1850 and died in 1844. It was a long life with many advances in the world around her. Cars, electric lights, airplanes, radios during her lifetime. Those are big things. My book was organized into decades and listed important events in her life, the births, the marriages, the deaths, and included mention of the big advances, all those important things. But most likely, those big advances didn't affect her until sometime after they actually appeared in the world, and I didn't know when or if these things happened. Um, I distributed the book to some of her descendants and got a response of, "That's nice." No, the book was interesting to me, but it is full of dates and not much about what her life was like. Did she ever see a movie? Did she fly in an airplane? If we were in person, I would pass this book around for everybody to see, but you'll just have to know that it was a book full of dates. So I'll regroup a little. This quilt is in the book. I have this quilt. I decided to tell the story of this quilt, but wanted to paint a picture of life at the time, not just BMD, birth, marriage, and death. And this quilt was made by the woman that I wrote the book about, Minnie. I once put the quilt in a display and attached a group sheet like this. Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? To genealogists, maybe. I also added a family tree. This quilt eventually came to me. Now I wanted to go beyond the family group sheet and give some context to the story. There's more to history than famous people and battles, and most of us don't have any famous people or battles built into our family history. Even if we do, there's more to the story than that. So this is Minnie, my great-grandmother, my great-grandparents. They had 8 kids. The oldest was Maggie, and the quilt was made as a wedding gift for Maggie and Billy. And the quilt eventually came to me. I'm always sort of amazed when this is at least what I've learned about the descendants, amazed that I'm the one that got it. But a little more about that later. I decided to try to tell a story about the quilt and my great-grandmother Minnie. This was sort of a new idea to me. However, all I really had was some family lore and the dates for my genealogy work. I needed to know about the time in which Minnie lived. Well, any story created about these early days will not be perfect or even true in every case. A good story can give us a feel for the life on the land. The initials here are of the bride and groom, William Gilbert, or Billy, and Maggie Gilbert, Margaret, the bride and groom. In order to know more about your ancestors' world, you'll need to research the world at the time. You've probably all done some of this, what was the weather like? What happened on certain dates or in that season or year? And I put a few links in the handout about suggestions for that. But where do you get this information? There's more places than family lore to look at. You've got family lore, traditional genealogy, and there's books about the time, local histories for counties and histories. You can find those in books and on websites. You can check Wikipedia, you can Google, all of these things. But you need a basic plan to be sure that you already sort of cover the life at the time, not just the battles and famous people. You want to find the small things to enlarge upon in the story. You want to use passages of description to move things along, not as just a separate block of historical backdrop. You don't want to do a history dump into your story. So you need to weave all these things together into a story. A basic plan would be needed to be sure that you cover a wide picture of life at the time. I taught world history to middle schoolers in Alum Rock and San Jose for many years. In the summer of 1985 and 86, I participated in SPICE workshop at Stanford, Stanford Program on International and Cross-Cultural Education, that's SPICE. And it is also part of BAJEP, the Bay Area Global Education Program, sponsored by the World Affairs Council. So the goal of this group, how can culture be described to elementary and secondary level students? We created the World Cultures Model. This became part of my history classroom for the next 20 years. It's still used in history classrooms today to help students understand the world beyond just famous people and battles. An important part of the model is interdependence, shown by overlapping circles. So you've got economics. Think about, as we look at this, your ancestors. Do you know their economics, their social life, their beliefs, their political life, their aesthetics? What was the geography in the area like? What was their history of the area? What was their culture? What interaction did they have with other cultures? And these are overlapping to show the interdependence. The mission of the World Cultures Model is then to give a well-rounded picture of a people in a time and place. And today we'll see how this can be applied to genealogy. By the way, other teachers have made fancier versions of the World Cultures Model. For our purposes, we'll stick with the basic model. A copy of this is included in your handout. The idea is to include something from each of these aspects to create a well-rounded picture, or in case of a culture, in our case of an ancestor. So if you just did the section on beliefs, you still wouldn't have that well-rounded picture. You need to sort of pick something from each of these. Here's how I worked it in my classroom. I showed the students my world cultures model that I made on 6 feet of butcher paper, and I attached pictures to go along with the different aspects and posted this in the classroom. I explained the different aspects while they were looking at their copy of the generic world cultural model and asked them to think about each of these aspects in their lives and create their own world cultures model. For instance, I said, okay, economics, I earn money by being a teacher, and I could say to the kids, how do you earn your money? Yeah, I do my chores, or my mother gives it to me, They had different answers. Um, I could say, I like opera, classical music, and such, and I'd say, okay, think about the music you like. So they could begin to see that this actually wasn't just me; it was also their lives too. We were talking about California, and my history was in Texas. So just and these were classes of many students who had been born in other countries so that they could make that part of the context for themselves too. 7th grade social studies begins with the fall of the Roman Empire. So the first few weeks in my class consisted of review of what they were supposed to have covered in the 6th grade, early civilizations. So we would do the prehistoric people, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Wang Ho, early America, Mesoamerica, Greece, Rome. These were the things I needed to sort of review in 6 weeks. Each class was divided into 8 groups, one for each of the early civilizations. Students were given readings, objects, and images to study about their group's assigned civilization. This was all information that I provided in the classroom. Internet access and equipment in Alum Rock was limited, so it fell to me to provide all the resources for each of these areas. I have boxes full of resources for each of these things. Each student in each group took one aspect of the world cultures model and found 1 or 2 examples for that aspect in their assigned culture. So a student in one group could say, okay, what kind of music did these people like, or what kind of art did they have? They didn't have to find all of the items in each circle. And here's some examples. If the students group was assigned Mohenjo-Daro, that's in early India, they got one of the pictures or artifacts they got was this, the Great Bath, which was the earliest public water tank of the ancient world used for special religious functions, where water was used to purify and renew the people who bathed there. Well, they could say, okay, that was religious. Or maybe, oh, I think it could be social because I bet they talked to each other when they were in this swimming pool kind of thing. But they needed to find something for that. If they were assigned Egypt, they might look at this picture from a tomb and say, okay, this is a religious thing. This guy's dead, and they're going to give him some gifts for the next life. They could talk about the art and politics. There's all kinds of things they could find just from looking at different. This wasn't the only artifact or picture they would have, but this is an example of it. If they had prehistoric people, they could look at the cave painting from the Lascaux cave and say, oh, if they painted this picture on the wall, that would make the animals happy so they could go hunt them and get their food. You get some economics. It was religious. If they had grease, the octopus jar would be used for trade, selling oil and artwork, of course. If they had Rome, they might look at the Colosseum and say, oh, yeah, the people I went there to see the events in the Colosseum, but that was a political ploy. In China, you would have the terracotta soldiers, thousands of them. sold political, social in Mesoamerica. These are Maya numbers. All the kids learned how to count in Maya. You can learn real fast a part of that. Each bar is worth 5 and each dot is worth 1. So, that would be 19 right here. But there's artwork and it was used for trade. And if they had Mesopotamia, this is called the Standard of Ur. There's a king, that's political. He's drinking wine. People are playing music for him. You get all the different aspects that they could cover in just that lesson for their group. So this is the outline of the world culture model that the students were to create. They had more information about what kinds of things would fit in each topic, and they were to find examples for the 5 circles and historical and geographic settings. The examples could be written or images with captions. Each group was given 6 feet of butcher paper, 7 large circles. I decided just to make things easier, historical and geographical were just circles on the edges. And they had markers and glue to create a poster. We did this over several weeks. Then they presented their findings to the class. Now there were 8 groups in each class, and I had 6 classes. So eventually I had 48 giant world cultures models posted all around my classroom. And I never took a picture of any of them. We didn't take pictures back then like we do now. This is one version of the lesson. This is the assignment sheet that would go in their notebooks. They had to do the research based on the things that I gave them. They could also look at library and internet, but as I've said, they didn't have much of that as a resource for them. Then they had to make this giant poster. They had to present their findings to the class, and the other students in the class had to take notes on a matrix. So if the group on Egypt is reporting, the rest of the class had a matrix with Egypt, and they were supposed to write down an economic and a social aspect for each thing that the groups told them about. They were I graded these things based on content, had they covered what they were supposed to do and how they delivered it to the class. And the final thing was that each student, every single kid, had to make a project for their civilization. Now, doing the math, this meant that I had maybe 288 projects coming to my classroom. And project due date was always an exciting day around the whole school because all the pyramids and all these things began showing up at that time. I have tons of pictures of projects, pyramids, temples, prehistoric dioramas, clay pots and figures, and Cabbage Patch cave kids. Where are those pictures? They aren't digitized, so they're somewhere in a box in an envelope. Back then, you couldn't just whip out your phone to take pictures. You had to bring your camera and get the pictures printed for everyone. And I've got pictures, but I don't know where they are. So this is a sample of what they got. So it's occurred to me that I could use this format to create a picture of a part of my family. In this case, to use the story of the quilt. Using this to tell about Minnie's quilt. Now, the culture, they lived in North Texas, and they had come from Mississippi and Alabama. And I'm going to look at all these different aspects of the life at the time. Well, how do you know about that stuff? I did a bunch of research. I looked at the weather, the world events, the books at the time, Wikipedia. I Googled a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the things I found was a county history for the county in Texas where Minnie lived. I was familiar with mug books. You probably run into them. They're county or city histories written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, this wedding was in 1888, so that fit perfectly. If you're looking at the 1700s, you may not find a mug book for 1700s. These were books in which ancestors might have a page or a paragraph of high praise about that particular ancestor. Um, those were often paid for. And so because of that, often your ancestors maybe didn't have the money to put that into the book. But so you might not find a page about your ancestor, but the books always have a section telling about the history of the county or city. I usually just dismiss that. My family's not there, so why should I bother? But now I've come up with a different use for that part of the book. At least half of this book told the history of the county, and you'll probably find that in other similar books of the time. The front section is full of interesting details about the history, geography, social, economic, political, aesthetic, and beliefs of the era and area. Even though my ancestors weren't often mentioned specifically, I knew they were part of what had happened, and that information could be used in creating a well-rounded picture of their life. And in this early description here, there's a lot of descriptions of wedding celebrations, so that would fit right in with my plan. Just to get you oriented, Wise County is in North Texas, just above Dallas and Fort Worth. Decatur is the county seat. My family purchased land just outside of Decatur in about 1878 and moved into town about 1900. So that was my plan, use the world cultures model to create a story about Minnie and the wedding quilt. Here's my story. It's very rough. This was a new venture for me. So it says, as she put the last stitches in the panel that she was contributing to the wedding quilt, Minnie felt the first flutters of her 7th pregnancy. It was January 1888, and her oldest daughter, Maggie, was to be married on February 1st. Now, let's pick this apart. You can to see what things I might have gotten from family lore or genealogy, or where this pieces of the story would come, since this is going to be a guide for expanding your family story. You want to think of the same kinds of things. Well, traditional genealogy. Well, I knew that Minnie had 8 kids, and I know that this wedding was on February 1st. And so I counted backwards from kid number 7 and figured, yeah, she was pregnant at this time. Just, some of those things. What could I add from the book that I found in other research? And I used a lot from the county history as I realized that I was creating a story, not writing my own research book. So first we'll look at the geographical setting: landforms, mountains, rivers, lakes, natural resources, and climate. Well, I've been to Wise County, but do I know some of this stuff in specific or what it was like in 1888? So I learned the soil spread out in the valley was rich, the forest virgin, the environing prairie hilltops bedecked with flowers and tall waving grass. Down through the valley coursed a creek of ever-flowing water. Its banks were deep, perpendicular, and precipitous. Some of this language is fairly highfalutin, so that wasn't what I wanted in my story. So I went looking for a creek in Wise County. Here's a creek in Wise County. Oh, wait, my story happens in February and it's wintertime, so I went looking for a different picture. This is snow on a farm in Wise County. I tried to make anything I found specific. This may not be an 1888 picture, but the idea is sort of there. What was the winter of 1887-88 like? I learned there were blizzards that year, 2 really big ones. There was a blizzard on the plains in January. It was called the schoolhouse blizzard or the children's blizzard. And this is a picture from that time and that blizzard. And there was a blizzard on the East Coast in March. It was a cold and snowy winter, and here's a picture from the blizzard on the East Coast in that time. If you've ever wondered about your relatives in 1888, that's a good clue. It was probably snow sometime that year, even in the more southern parts of the nation. This new to me knowledge was a product of my focus search while using the world cultures model. Continuing the story. When they moved to Wise County, they built their home in a valley. In summertime, there were flowers and tall waving grasses along the creek. Now, the recent snow had given everything a dusting of white. At that time, there was no railroad, so her husband Will had hauled the lumber and other building materials for their farm in their wagon all the way from Fort Worth, over 30 miles away. Well, I'd read that stuff about all the flowers, so I had to put flowers in there somewhere. And you see where I've gotten that. My great grandmother didn't mention that there were flowers in the creek. I did learn that they certainly had snow that winter. The hauling of the materials for the house came from a newspaper article about Minnie on her 90th birthday. I'll show you that in just a bit. Next, I looked at the historical setting, past events. Upon gaining authority from the legislature, the counties holding school lands hastened to put their lands on the market, at the same time advertising their offerings, which induced the rapid immigration, which is another significant occurrence distinguishing this particular time. Then it was that the Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama Democrats began to move in. That's my guys. Such lands as described were attainable on terms of $3 per acre upon payment of 1/10 of the principal at purchase and 1/10 and interest annually until the debt was liquidated. Well, I knew they had land, and now I found more information about that. Oh, and they came from Mississippi. So I looked that up. They had had a farm in Grenada, Mississippi, here. And I knew from that newspaper article that they had taken the train. So I figured, I looked at what trains were around in that time period. They could have also taken a train south. There were trains by Grenada over here, but I knew that they had gotten off the train at Sherman and took a buggy to Nocona to visit a daughter and then to Decatur. So this is my conjecture about how they got that. And this is a newspaper article that I've referenced several times. This is Minnie on her 90th birthday, and learned lots of things from that then I could go back and add into my story. 10 years earlier, the family had come to Texas by train from the family farm in Mississippi. Many had worked to settle in the new country. The lease of large tracts of school lands had made it possible for her husband to purchase preemption land where they could raise cattle and send them to market on the Chisholm Trail. Oh dear, Chisholm Trail. Better find out about that. Obviously, the part about the train came from the newspaper clipping, and the part about the school lands came from the mug book. I'm learning more about things that they experienced just by doing this lots of extra research. So here's where they settled, beautiful Wise County. So let's take a look now at economics. Scarcity, production, distribution, transportation. Also, the people began the raising of small grain, wheat, oats, and barley, of which crops enough were raised to provide the family bread. Now and then we sent a wagon to Shreveport or Houston for coffee and sugar and such groceries, but we didn't use sugar much. So I thought, oh, what about a wedding cake? It probably wasn't something like this. This was the fashionable cake of the time. And I learned that a lot of the decorations on these cakes were actually just pieces of lace that were attached to the cake and then pulled off when they cut it up. But still, way out here in the boonies, I did know that they would have had a cake like this. So I looked at regular cakes that could have been something like this, just a white cake, simple with powdered sugar icing, but remember, they didn't use sugar much. Then I also learned that another traditional celebration cake was simply a marble pound cake. These were popular at the time, but I have some idea of what that might have been. By the way, the mug book contained lots of descriptions about things they used as substitutes for coffee. Continuing with the economy, settlers raised cattle and hogs and took them to market on the Chisholm Trail. Well-known trails were beaten out over which thousands of cattle were driven northward in spring and summer and sold at an average price of $36 to $40 per head. So let's look at the Chisholm Trail. I heard about that. I watched those Saturday morning cowboy stories, and I knew some uncles were ranchers with cattle, but Decatur. So I found a map. In the old Chisholm Trail, crossing the Red River at Red River Station, and then in Montague County, and then up through the territory to Abilene was the favorite route. So here it is coming from Corpus Christi and from San Antonio through Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, and right here outside of Decatur. Oh, how many times have we been to Decatur? I didn't know about this, but now makes sense. In 1882, the Fort Worth and Denver Railway reached Decatur, opening up trade and travel. So here's the story. From the small wheat flour from the small wheat field she had planted was in the pantry, ready to use for the breads and cakes for the wedding, and there was even a little real coffee to offer the guest. Coffee and sugar had been bartered with the money from the sale of the cattle that they sent along the Chisholm Trail. The railroad had come through their nearby town a few years earlier, and supplies were more available. Again, I'd learned that they probably grew a little bit of wheat, so they got the flour. Where would she have gotten the sugar? Reading just these other sources, I'm making up a story about how she's getting ready for the wedding and, oh, coffee for the guest. It's really fancy. And put the cattle on the Chisholm Trail. So how about social? Family life, customs, leisure activities. A distinguishing social custom to which the majority was committed and which none dared question was the regular system of hospitable visits which the people paid to each other in the absence of vehicles. The custom was to ride horseback, the long rides training the women to horsemanship and effecting robust physical health. I looked for pictures. This is a picture from 1888. Now I know these ladies are riding mules, but they're clearly all dressed up to go somewhere fancy. And I never thought about how people would get to these events. Most pictures and things of the time show buggies, the Surrey with the fringe on top kind of thing. But maybe in North Texas, they look at other ways of getting around. So back to the story. Many hoped there would not be more snow before the wedding, making it difficult for the neighbors who would be gathering for the wedding, coming long distances from their homesteads by horseback to stay for several days. So we've got from the research more snow, how they would get there, about the horseback. I sort of thought about this, where are they going to put all these horses? Well, they're going to put them in the barn. I guess got to do a little more research on this, but it's something that began to occur to me. Continuing with social, early schools, the arts and sciences found no place in the curriculum of the pioneer pedagogue. He usually graduated his pupils by teaching them to read, write, and spell, and to work a few sums in arithmetic. Rarely ever introduced the study of geography. Oh, wow. That was early schools. This is a picture here of a school in 1871. So by 1871, they were doing a little bit more in the schools, and I'd love to figure out what was on this chart back here. At any rate, So back to the story. The younger children, Billy, Walter, and Edna, came in from school, shaking the snow off their coats and stamping their boots on the floor. Minnie was glad that the nearby town of Decatur had finally instituted a real public school. The old schoolmaster had taught only reading, writing, spelling, and a few sums, with no place for art, science, geography, or history. So you see, I'm getting this research built into the story. And if you're thinking of writing a story about your ancestor, sometimes just giving them all the flat research is not going to get their interest going, and this kind of thing might as well. Beliefs, religion, myths, rituals. 1854. The Methodists were first to unfurl the banner of the cross in Wise County. In 1862, the first church organization occurred. This was effected through the Methodist denomination, of which church only a few members resided in town being Decatur. There was lots about Baptist and other denominations, but my family was staunchly Methodist, so that's what I looked at. Baptist and Methodist religious revivals, camp meetings were held in the late 1800s. This reunion pavilion was built in 1896 to replace an earlier one, and I understand that this one still exists, and grand reunion events are held every summer. As a child, I went with my grandmother to a few times to revivals that were held in this reunion pavilion. Card playing was another indulgence, was not regarded as specifically immoral by a large number of the masculine gender who found the game of poker agreeable for passing away the time. Not for Methodists, no card playing back then. So in the story, after a fire, the Methodist church in town had gathered the money to build a beautiful new building, but the only meeting place at the time was the outdoor pavilion at the reunion grounds, so the wedding ceremony would take place in Minnie's home. Oh, if the wedding celebration would take place in the barn. So after the wedding, they would go out in the barn for a celebration. She hoped there would be no card playing at the wedding. Her Methodist upbringing would not allow for that. And then I began to think more about all those horses and putting them in the barn in the cold winter. And so I need to do some more research and maybe rewrite this part of the story. At that time, card playing was frowned upon by Methodists. Political leadership, decision making. During Reconstruction, the iron hand of the autocrat began to be felt everywhere in Texas. The registration laws were tightened and strengthened and more rigidly enforced. In this way, the trend of affairs grew gradually worse until 1869, when the very worst was inaugurated with the election of Edmund J. Davis, high-handed despot, as governor. I hadn't thought much about how Reconstruction after the Civil War had affected my family. Wise County was full of Confederate veterans. This passage certainly shows that feelings were still running pretty high when it was written in 1907. I sort of went out on another side trip to find out about this despot, Edmund J. Davis. It seemed to me that this might be an important topic at the wedding. Even though the changes had been made years earlier, there would be lots of Civil War veterans there to rerun all of the difficulties. A little bit about Reconstruction in Texas. There's this guy, Richard Koch. He was a secessionist and Civil War veteran. And after the war, he was elected to the Texas Supreme Court. But this guy, Sheridan, who was the commander in military rule, had removed Koch from the Texas Supreme Court. And this made Koch popular in the Texas people, among the Texas people who were for many Confederate veterans. And in 1873, he defeated this guy, who had been the governor, 2-1. Davis refused to step down, and drama and violence ensued. He did finally step down, and Koch supposedly reestablished constitutional law and order after more than a dozen years of war and military rule. Koch, a Democrat, became the first of a dynasty of Democratic Party governors in Texas that lasted well over 100 years unbroken. When I grew up in Texas, everybody was Democrat. It didn't have anything else, but they were Confederate Democrats. I learned too, Reconstruction difficulties all came to a happy conclusion. 1874, the era being still further brightened by the defeat of the despot Davis and the election of the good, brave Koch to the governorship of Texas. The election of Governor Koch in 1874 delivered them from their tyrannies and restored them to their old rights and liberties. So how can I put this in this story? Politically, things had finally begun to settle after the end of Reconstruction and the election of Richard Koch as governor. Koch had reestablished constitutional law and order. Minnie's husband and his friends, all Confederate veterans, were happy with the way things were going. Her son Gwen, just out of school, was planning to run for county clerk. Hugh knew what heights he could read to. This reflects the feelings written about by the authors. Minnie's husband was a Confederate veteran. His pension information tells about his capture and imprisonment, but that's another story. And you just know that when all these old guys got together, they would be revisiting all of this. My family members spent a lifetime as part of their communities. I want to learn what they did and how they served their community, what their impact was, and how their experiences as part of the Confederacy affected their lives and community in which they lived. I try to approach their experience objectively and learn about the lives. They were shaped by the culture and beliefs around them and made their own choices. Not doesn't oblige me to embrace the cause they fought for, the people who identify with it today. But this story was being told by Minnie back in 1888, so that's another bit to look at. Minnie's family did become involved in politics. Son Gwen became a U.S. congressman in the House of Representatives. Son-in-law Billy, the one who got married in 1888, was chair of the Democratic Party and sheriff of Wise County. Daughter Minnie Pearl, my grandmother, the one who was born after the wedding in the story, was once a candidate for the state legislature. That's a woman running for office in the 1950s. Well, let's finally look at aesthetics. We've got art, music, dance, literature, leisure activities. Another inevitable accompaniment of these festivities was dancing. A platform was arranged and the swains danced to their heart's content by playing a small fee for each step engaged in. The old-style square dances were in vogue, and old tunes like Arkansas Traveler or Champagne Charlie were the only ones known. The fiddler was noted for his qualities of endurance and in much demand on these occasions. That's in addition to horse racing, card playing, and barbecues. Dancing, however, was not confined to the barbecues. It was practiced at all celebrations and other entertainments and indulged in many of the homes where religious scruples did not interfere. That's a reference to Baptists who didn't dance. Methodists did, so they could have dancing at the wedding. Quilting and house raising were two remaining social functions which brought the people together in bonds of intimacy and kept a glow of good feeling alive among them. So this is a portion of the quilt. Each panel, you can see the panel here, was contributed by a different person. And of course, they could have contributed to house raising, and barn raisings all around the area. The home was artificially lighted with homemade tallow candles made in every home where the proper molds were in possession. A second means of light being to saturate a woolen string in lard oil and set it ablaze. The illumination afforded assistance in reading the Dallas Herald or the Clarksville Standard, the two best-known pioneer papers in circulation. Perhaps my family had a candle mold. The newspaper here from 1887 December, which would have been one that could have been there at the wedding, surprised me at the amount of advertising and overwhelming. And the story finished. The wedding guest would help her finish the quilt, enjoy a barbecue, and hold a square dance. Perhaps someone would have a copy of the Dallas Herald for everyone to catch up on the outside world. Victorian crazy quilts were made of scraps of velvet, silk, and brocade taken from old dresses, candy boxes, and ribbons, and pieced in random shapes with decorative silk stitching on the seams to show off needlework skills. This quilt has over 20 different styles of stitches, each one of these pieces having a different stitch to connect it to the others. This is Minnie, my great-grandmother, the one who tells the story. Here's her initials in that quilt, Minerva Jane Williams, and of the bride and groom, William Gilbert and Margaret Gilbert, Billy and Maggie, in this part of the quilt. Only the top of this quilt was finished in time for the wedding. Maggie and Billy were married for 51 years. After their death, the quilt was returned to Maggie's mother, Minnie, and eventually came to me. Only the top had been finished. It wasn't completely finished until 1970 when my mother put a border and the backing on it. In my antiques class, we learned to put a description of a family heirloom with the item. I've learned how to store the quilt correctly and added this description. It includes, by the way, ribbons from the rifle company shoots. And, oh, well, I bet that latest rifle shoot would have been a topic at the wedding, you know. Oh, yeah, we went there and we practiced shooting. Many of my grandmother, who was born after the wedding, lived in the family home where my mother and her siblings grew up. It was my first home for the first 6 months of my life. And the quilt eventually came to my mother and then to me, my grandmother's oldest child. So what to do with this heirloom quilt? None of my cousins, Minnie's descendants, remember how many of them I found? None of them are interested, at least the ones that I'm in contact with, many of them through our shared genealogy. My plan has always been, we'll just give it to the local museum. Perhaps the Wise County Heritage Museum would have been interested. After a destructive fire 2 years ago, the museum was only accepting cash donations. But surely, I've thought, as they rebuild their collection, this and other items that I have from the early days of Decatur and Wise County might find a home here. But I have an update. Just March, that's yesterday, March 2025, I made contact with someone from the museum. They now have a space for things, and we're working on a way to get the quilt to them. I need to find a box and pack it correctly and send it off to Wise County. And I do hope that some of the Wise County people have been able to attend today. And, you know, if you can suggest corrections to my story about Wise County, send me a gentle note and I'll see about that. I haven't written an ending to the story of the quilt, but Margaret Ulrika Williams, Maggie, and William S. Gilbert Billy did get married on February 1st, 1888. Billy did become the sheriff of Wise County. They had no children, but did, wait, that's another story for another day, so I'll leave the story here. This concludes the venture into the use of the world cultures model to expand my family story, and I hope that you can find a similar use for it. I use books, a lot of Googling, but any kind of research can be used to learn more about the life of a family. With that, I'll end for now. I hope you can find a way to use the world cultures model to enhance